The firelit chamber crackled with tension. Clara's tear-streaked defiance clashed with the storm raging in Alpha King Lucian's eyes, his fury breaking into disbelief as an unseen force bound them together. His hand trembled as it reached for her, caught between rage and fate. She had only wanted to survive the night, but destiny had other plans. A cruel king's punishment twisting into a bond strong enough to topple a kingdom. When your greatest enemy becomes your destiny, nothing remains untouched. And before this story carries you further, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. It would truly make my day. Let me know in the comments where in the world you're watching from, because your voice matters here. The great iron-strapped doors of the throne room groaned open, a sound like a dying beast. Clara Vale felt the noise vibrate through the stone floor and up into her bones. A grim welcome to the heart of her enemy's power. Two hulking guards, their hands like slabs of granite on her arms, shoved her forward into the cavernous space. The air inside was a physical weight, thick with the scent of burning oak from a dozen torches, the metallic tang of iron, and the cloying perfume of fear. High above, narrow windows choked with grime allowed only feeble fingers of gray light to penetrate the gloom, illuminating a billion dust motes, dancing in silent, chaotic celebration of the decay. Her gaze, sharp and defiant, swept across the room. Stone walls, cold and weeping with damp, were draped with ancient, tattered banners. They depicted the brutal history of the Storm lineage's conquests. A gallery of violence. She saw snarling wolves, the sigil of the king, devouring stags, their antlers snapped and broken. She saw them tearing at the wings of falcons, their talons rending painted silk. It was a room built not to inspire loyalty, but to command obedience through terror. The court, a collection of richly dressed alphas and betas, stood silent as statues, their faces carefully blank, their eyes fixed on the floor. Not one of them dared to meet her gaze. They were prisoners too, she realized, just in more comfortable chains. Her own chains were anything but comfortable. Heavy, cold iron cuffs bit into the raw skin of her wrists and ankles, their weight a constant, dragging reminder of her failure. The links clinked a mournful rhythm with every step she was forced to take across the polished black stone. She stumbled on an uneven flagstone, the sudden jerk sending a jolt of pain up her spine, but she caught herself, her jaw tight. She would not fall. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her on her knees. And then she saw him. Alpha King Lucian Storm sat upon his throne, a monstrous thing carved from the heart of a petrified weirwood tree. It looked less like a seat of power and more like a cage of gnarled, blackened branches, its limbs twisted in some ancient, silent agony. He was perfectly still, a predator waiting for the prey to be driven into his path. His presence dominated the vast hall, a vortex of power that pulled all light and sound towards him. His eyes, the color of a winter sky before a blizzard, were fixed on her, and their intensity was a physical blow. One of his hands rested on the arm of the throne, his long, powerful fingers tapping a slow, deliberate rhythm that echoed the frantic beating of her own heart. The head guard, a brute with a flattened nose and a scar that split his eyebrow in two, finally shoved her to a halt in the center of the room. "Alpha King Lucian," his voice boomed, unnecessarily loud in the tomb-like silence. "We present the traitor, Clara Vale, leader of the rebellion in the Gilded Canyons." Lucian's tapping stopped. The silence that followed was more profound, more terrifying than the guard's announcement. For a long moment, he simply watched her, his gaze stripping away her ragged clothes, her grime, her defiance, leaving her soul bare and shivering in the cold of his appraisal. When he finally spoke, his voice was not the shout she expected, but something far more dangerous, a low rumble like distant thunder. "Leave us." The command was simple, yet it sent a wave of motion through the court. Nobles and sycophants turned as one, their fine silks and velvets whispering as they fled the room, their relief a palpable thing. The guards gave her one last shove and retreated, their heavy boots echoing until the great doors boomed shut, sealing her inside with the Wolf King. Only two of his most trusted betas remained, silent sentinels flanking the exit, their hands resting on the pommels of their swords. "Clara Vale," Lucian said, the name a curse on his tongue. He still had not moved from his throne. A little Omega who thought she could gnaw at the heels of a king. Your followers are dead or scattered. Your cause is ash. Tell me, was it worth it? A fire, hot and pure, burned through the fear in her veins. She lifted her chin, the movement pulling at the bruised muscles in her neck. My people starved while your court grew fat on roasted boar and spiced wine, she spat, her voice raw but clear. We watched our children grow thin while your hunting hounds ate better than our elders. We asked for bread, and you sent swords. Any price is worth fighting for a life better than the one you give us. A flicker of something, not quite surprise but perhaps interest, disturbed the cold stillness of his face. He had expected tears. Pleas, the broken whimpers of a defeated rebel. He had not expected this burning, unyielding fury. It angered him, this lack of fear, but it also intrigued him. It was like finding a single perfect flame, burning in the heart of a blizzard. Slowly, with a grace that was terrifying in a man so large, Lucian rose from his throne. He descended the 3 black stone steps of the dais, his movements fluid and deliberate. The throne room, already a place of dread, seemed to shrink, the walls closing in as he began to circle her. He moved like the wolves on his banners, a predator assessing its cornered prey, his boots making no sound on the stone. He was close enough now that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, a furnace of contained power. She could smell him, a scent of leather, cold steel, and something wilder underneath, like the air after a lightning strike. He stopped directly in front of her, so close that she had to crane her neck to look up at his face. He was a mountain of a man, his shoulders broad enough to block out the light from the torches behind him, casting his face in shadow. With a single unforgiving finger, he tilted her chin up, forcing her to meet his gaze. His touch was surprisingly gentle, yet it sent a jolt of pure revulsion through her. "You have courage," he murmured, his voice a low vibration that she felt in her teeth. "I'll grant you that. A fiery spirit in a fragile shell. It would be a waste to simply hang you from the battlements for the crows to feast on. I am a king who appreciates value." Clara's lip curled. "If you're looking for me to beg, you'll be waiting until the mountains crumble into dust." A cruel smile, thin and sharp, touched his lips for the first time. It did not reach his eyes. "Oh, I have something far more interesting in mind. A bargain." He let go of her chin and began to circle her again, his words weaving a new kind of trap around her. "You are condemned as a traitor. The penalty, as you well know, is death. A swift execution would be merciful, and I am not feeling merciful. However, I will offer you a chance at life, a single chance." He paused behind her, his voice a whisper in her ear. "Survive one night in my bed. Show me that the fire in your eyes is not just empty defiance. Endure what I command. And if you're still standing by dawn, I will grant you your freedom. You may walk out of this castle, out of these gates, and never return. A free woman." The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. Shock, cold and sickening, flooded her system, followed by a wave of burning disgust. Her mind reeled. This was his punishment. Not a clean death, but the ultimate humiliation. To be used as a common whore for his amusement. A plaything to be broken and discarded. "You would use me as a whore for your amusement," she choked out, the words tasting like bile. He completed his circle and stood before her once more, his expression one of cold calculation. "I would use you as a lesson," he corrected, his voice hard as iron, "to prove to myself, and to any who might still harbor rebellious thoughts, that all defiance eventually breaks before me, that all fire can be extinguished." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping even lower. "But there is another option, a possibility you could not have dreamed of in your squalid little canyon." Clara stared at him, her mind unable to process what more he could possibly say. "If you not only survive," he continued, his eyes boring into hers, "but if you impress me, if you prove that you are more than just a common rebel with a loud mouth, I will give you something more than freedom. I will give you power." He let that hang in the air for a beat before delivering the final insane pronouncement. "A seat at my side. My throne." The proposition was so utterly mad, so far beyond the realm of anything she could have conceived, that for a moment she could only stare at him in stunned silence. He was a tyrant, a monster, but he was not insane. This had to be a joke, another layer to his cruel game, designed to make her hope before he crushed her completely. The throne? It was absurd, a mad king's jest. Her mind discarded it instantly, seizing on the only part of the bargain that mattered, the only path that led away from the gallows: freedom. She saw it then, a sliver of light in the suffocating darkness of her fate. One night. She had to survive one night. She had endured starvation, the loss of her friends, the crushing of her rebellion. She had watched her world burn to ash around her. Surely she could endure one night of humiliation at the hands of this man if it meant she could walk away with her life. She could steal her mind, lock her soul away in a place he could not touch, and simply endure. Her initial shock and disgust hardened into a cold, sharp resolve. This was not a seduction. It was a battlefield. The king's bed was just another arena, and her survival was the only victory that mattered. She would not let him break her. She would endure his touch, his cruelty, his power, and she would meet the dawn, still standing. Lucian watched the war of emotions on her face, the horror giving way to a grim determination that settled deep in her eyes. He saw her latch onto the promise of freedom, just as he knew she would. He saw her dismiss the offer of the throne as the ravings of a madman. It pleased him. He wanted her to fight, to resist, to believe she could win this game on her own terms. It would make her eventual breaking all the more satisfying. He was both repulsed by her status as a traitorous Omega and inexplicably drawn to the iron strength of her spirit. He wanted to possess it, to master it, to see it bow before him. Clara took a deep, shuddering breath, the cold air burning her lungs. She met the Alpha King's gaze, her own eyes now as hard and unyielding as the stone walls around them. The terror was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was caged behind a wall of pure, unadulterated will. "I accept," she said, her voice barely a whisper, yet it echoed in the vast, silent throne room like a scream. The guards did not speak. They simply took her arms again, their grips like iron vices, and hauled her from the throne room. The heavy doors closed behind them, and the oppressive silence of the king's presence was replaced by the echoing emptiness of the castle's corridors. They marched her up winding stone staircases, past arrow-slit windows that showed only slivers of a cold, indifferent moon. Clara kept her head high, memorizing every turn, every shadow, her mind a map-maker, charting a course for an escape she knew was impossible. The hope was a fool's comfort, but it was all she had. Finally, they stopped before a set of massive oak doors, banded with black iron in the shape of snarling wolf heads. One of the guards produced a heavy key, the sound of it scraping in the lock unnaturally loud in the quiet hallway. He shoved the door open and then, with a final, brutal push, sent her stumbling into the room. The door slammed shut behind her, the bolt shooting home with a sound of absolute finality. A death sentence delivered in iron and wood. For a long moment, Clara simply stood there, her body rigid, her breath catching in her throat. This was it, the gilded cage. The room was a stark, shocking contrast to the cold, oppressive stone of the rest of the castle. It was a space of immense, almost decadent luxury. A massive hearth dominated one wall, a roaring fire casting dancing shadows that made the room feel alive. The floor was covered in thick, soft furs, wolf and bear pelts that swallowed the sound of her ragged breathing. Shelves filled with leather-bound books lined another wall, their gold leaf titles glinting in the firelight. It was a room of warmth, of knowledge, of wealth. It was a room that spoke of power, but also of a profound, aching loneliness. And in the center of it all, like a sacrificial altar, was the bed. It was enormous, carved from the same dark wood as the throne, but piled high with silks and furs of white and silver. It looked soft, inviting, and to Clara it was the most terrifying thing she had ever seen. This was her execution block, her dueling ground. Her terror was a living thing, a cold serpent coiling in her gut, but she forced it down, transmuting it into the familiar, cleansing heat of anger. Her eyes, sharp and analytical, swept the room again, not as a prisoner, but as a soldier. She catalogued everything: the heavy bronze candlestick on a side table, the iron fire poker resting by the hearth, the weight of her own chains. Her mind raced, calculating angles, possibilities, the slimmest chances of turning this cage into a weapon. She would not be a passive victim. She would not make this easy for him. The door opened again, so silently that she jumped when she heard the soft click of the latch. Lucian entered, and the vast room seemed to shrink around him. He had shed his formal armor and the heavy tunic he had worn in the throne room. Now he wore only a simple dark linen shirt and trousers. The change was disorienting. Without the trappings of his kingship, he looked less like a monarch and more like a man, albeit a terrifyingly large and powerful one. The lean, corded muscles of his arms and chest were visible beneath the thin fabric, and the raw physical presence of him was somehow more intimidating than his crown and throne. He moved to a table where a decanter of deep red wine sat beside 2 silver goblets. He poured the wine, the sound of the liquid splashing into the cups a delicate counterpoint to the roaring fire. He turned and offered one of the goblets to her, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. "No need to be so tense, little wolf," he said, his voice a low murmur that still managed to fill the room. "The night is young. Drink. It will dull the senses, make the time pass more easily." Clara stared at the goblet, at the dark red liquid that looked so much like blood. She shook her head, the movement small and sharp. "No." He raised an eyebrow. "It is not poisoned, if that is what you fear. I have no need for such cowardly methods." "I don't want my senses dulled," she replied, her voice tight and strained, but she forced it to remain steady. "I want my senses sharp. I want to remember every moment of this humiliation, so that when I am free, the memory will fuel my hatred for you. It will be a fire that keeps me warm for the rest of my days." A strange look passed over his face, a mixture of annoyance and something else, something he couldn't name. He had expected fear, yes, but he had expected it to be a cowering, pleading thing. Her fear was a weapon, a whetstone she used to sharpen her own defiance. He had brought her here to break her, to assert his dominance, to satisfy a cold, cruel impulse. But as he looked at her, standing so small and yet so unbowed in the center of his room, he felt a confusing and unwelcome shift within himself. His inner wolf, the beast that was the core of his alpha power, was agitated. It was not the familiar, aggressive thrill of a predator before a kill. It was a strange, possessive recognition, a low growl in the back of his mind that was not of anger, but of something else. He felt a pull toward her, a magnetic current that infuriated him. He was the king. He was the one in control. This Omega, this traitor, should inspire nothing in him but contempt. Yet this confusing connection, this infuriating pull, was undeniable. He set her goblet down with a sharp click of silver on wood. The standoff stretched, the silence broken only by the crackle and spit of the fire. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. She braced herself, her muscles tensing, preparing for the violence she knew was inevitable. She thought of her people, of the children with hollow eyes, and the elders who had faded away in the last, brutal winter. She thought of the hope they had placed in her, a hope she had failed to fulfill. Their faces, their memory, became her armor. She would not break. For them, she would endure. Lucian's patience, never a deep well to begin with, finally snapped. He was used to immediate, unquestioning obedience. Her silent defiance was a grating insult, a challenge to his absolute authority in his own sanctum. He had offered her wine, a small mercy, and she had thrown it back in his face. Fine. The time for games was over. He crossed the space between them in 2 long, silent strides. Before Clara could even react, his hand shot out and clamped around her upper arm. His grip was like iron, his fingers digging into her flesh, and she cried out, a small, sharp sound of pain and surprise. His intention was simple, brutal, to drag her towards the bed and begin the grim transaction of their bargain. But the moment his skin touched hers, the world shattered. It was not a spark. It was a cataclysm. A bolt of pure, white-hot lightning shot from his hand into her arm, searing a path straight to the center of her soul. A violent, uncontrollable power erupted between them, a force of nature unleashed within the confines of the chamber. They both cried out, their voices mingling in a shared shout of agony and shock. The force of it threw them backward, breaking his grip, sending them stumbling away from each other as if they had been struck by a physical blow. Clara fell against the edge of a heavy wooden table, the impact jarring her teeth, her arm burning as if it had been branded. Lucian staggered back several steps, his hand raised, staring at it as if it were a venomous snake. The very air in the room had changed. It crackled with a raw, visible energy, the dust motes dancing in the firelight, now swirling in frantic, electrified patterns. A strange golden light bloomed behind their eyes, a faint ethereal glow that mirrored the others. The sensory overload was absolute. The air was suddenly thick with the scent of ozone, the clean, sharp smell that follows a lightning strike. For Lucian, the scent was instantly followed by something else, something that cut through the haze of shock and pain. It was the scent of pine needles crushed underfoot and the crisp, clean air of the first winter snow. It was a scent that spoke of home, of peace, of a missing part of his very being that he had never known was gone until this exact moment, when it felt like it was snapping violently back into place. His wolf, the primal core of his alpha soul, rose up within him and howled, a single, silent, deafening word that echoed in the chambers of his mind. Mate. For Clara, the experience was just as powerful, but infinitely more terrifying. Beneath the smell of ozone, a different scent flooded her senses, overwhelming and primal. It was the smell of a coming thunderstorm, of damp, ancient earth, and of the wild, untamed power of the man before her. It was a scent that should have terrified her, yet her soul seemed to recognize it, to lean into it. She felt a sudden, shocking, and utterly horrifying sense of belonging, as if her entire life had been a lock, and this man, this monster, was the only key that could ever fit. It was a feeling of being seen, of being known to her very core, and it was the most terrifying thing she had ever experienced. Lucian stared at her, his chest heaving, his mind reeling. His eyes, wide with disbelief, were still glowing with that faint golden light. What was that? He breathed, the words ragged. He took a step back, his hand still held out as if to ward her off. What sorcery is this? What have you done? Clara clutched her burning arm, her own eyes wide with a dawning, sickening horror. The stories were ancient, whispers from a time before kings and rebellions, stories of the moon goddess and the threads of fate she wove. She had thought them children's tales, fables, but the feeling, the scent, the undeniable connection that now thrummed between them like a plucked string on a celestial harp, it was real. It's not sorcery, she whispered, the words catching in her throat. Her mind screamed in denial. It couldn't be. Not him. Anyone but him. It can't be. Lucian's gaze was locked on her, his own shock warring with a lifetime of command and control. The rage was still there, but it was now mingled with a profound, world-shattering awe. His wolf was clawing at the inside of his mind, demanding he acknowledge the truth, demanding he claim what was his. He looked at this woman, this rebel, this omega he had planned to break and discard, and the impossible, undeniable truth finally forced its way past his lips, his voice a hoarse blend of fury and wonder. Mate, he choked out, the word feeling alien and sacred on his tongue. He shook his head as if to clear it of this madness. My wolf, it knows you. He took a staggering step towards her, his glowing eyes fixed on her face, his entire world tilting on its axis. You are my fated mate. The words, fated mate, hung in the supercharged air, more shocking than the crackle of energy that had just thrown them apart. The concept was a dagger in Clara's heart, a poison in Lucian's mind. For a stunned moment, there was only the sound of the fire and their two ragged breaths, a frantic, discordant rhythm. Then, the shock shattered, and rage, pure and absolute, rushed in to fill the void. Lucian was the first to move. He didn't step toward her, but away, pacing before the hearth like a caged wolf, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The golden glow in his eyes had not faded. It had intensified, burning with a furious, disbelieving light. "No," he snarled. The word ripped from his throat. "It is a lie. A trick." He spun on her, his face a mask of thunderous fury. His accusation a physical force. "This is your doing. Some Omega witchery. A desperate, pathetic ploy to save your own skin. You think you can bind me to you with spells and illusions? You think you can usurp my throne with this fantasy?" Clara stared at him, and a sound bubbled up from her chest. A sound she didn't recognize as her own. It was a laugh, but it was a terrible thing, broken and sharp, edged with hysteria and despair. "A trick?" she cried, the laughter turning into a sob of pure, undiluted horror. "You think I would choose this? You think I would choose to be bound for eternity to a monster, a tyrant who slaughtered my people and burned my home to the ground?" She threw her arms out, the heavy chains clanking, a bitter mockery of her new, invisible bonds. "I would rather have felt the hangman's rope around my neck. I would rather have died on the gallows, free, than be chained to your very soul. My only goal was to escape you, not to be shackled to you for the rest of my miserable life." Her words, filled with a venom born of absolute conviction, struck him harder than any physical blow could have. He saw the genuine horror in her eyes, the revulsion that mirrored his own, and it only confused him more. If it wasn't her trick, then what was it? The work of the moon goddess? A cruel joke played by fate? The thought was intolerable. He was a king. He forged his own destiny with steel and fire. He was not a puppet for the gods. "Do not call me a monster, Omega," he growled, his voice dropping to a dangerous low. He stalked towards her, the floorboards groaning under his weight. The air between them was a physical thing now, a thick magnetic field that both pushed them apart and pulled them together. He could feel the frantic, terrified beating of her heart as if it were in his own chest, a maddening rhythm that echoed the turmoil in his own soul. "You know nothing of what it takes to hold this kingdom together. You see a tyrant. I see a man who has bled to keep the wolves from the door, both outside our borders and within my own court. I know what it's like to be crushed under your heel," she shot back, refusing to retreat. Even as he loomed over her, a mountain of fury. "I know the feel of your boot on my neck. That is all I need to know. You speak of keeping wolves from the door, but you are the beast who devoured us all." The bond, this unwanted, undeniable connection, was a torment. It forced empathy where there should be none. As he glared down at her, his rage was absolute. Yet beneath it, he could feel the searing grief that fueled her defiance. He could feel the ghosts of her lost people standing behind her, their silent accusation a weight on his soul. And she, looking up at him, saw the monster she hated, but she could also feel the crushing loneliness that surrounded him, the paranoia of a king who trusted no one, the deep brickwork, ancient wound of a past betrayal that had forged him into the man he was. The shared feelings were a violation, an intimacy neither of them wanted, and it only made them angrier. They were lashing out, trying to sever the connection, trying to deny the undeniable truth that their souls were now irrevocably intertwined. Just as Lucian reached for her again, his hands trembling with the urge to either shake her or pull her into an embrace he didn't understand, a sharp, insistent knock echoed from the chamber door. Knock, knock, knock. The sound was like a bucket of ice water thrown over the fire of their rage. They both froze, their heads snapping towards the door. The golden glow in their eyes flickered, and for a single heart-stopping moment, a new emotion eclipsed the anger, something far colder and more immediate: panic. A voice smooth as oiled leather, but with an undertone of steel, came from the hallway. "Your Majesty, is everything well? I heard shouting. The Omega is not causing you undue trouble." Clara's blood ran cold. She recognized that voice. It was Lord Valerius, Lucian's most ambitious and cruel beta, the very man who had personally overseen the brutal suppression of her rebellion. He was the architect of her people's suffering, the face of her deepest hatred, second only to the king himself. In that split second, Lucian and Clara exchanged a look. It was not a look of enemies. It was a look of conspirators. a silent, frantic communication born of a shared, deadly secret. If Valerius, with his sharp eyes and sharper ambition, sensed what had happened, if he even suspected that the king was now fated to a rebel Omega, he would see it not as a miracle, but as a weakness, a compromise, a crack in the foundation of the throne he so clearly coveted. He could use it to declare Lucian unfit, to rally the other Alphas, to plunge the kingdom into a civil war he was poised to win. Lucian's transformation was instantaneous. The chaotic fury vanished from his face, replaced by the cold, unreadable mask of the king. He took a deliberate step away from Clara, putting space between them, and his voice, when he spoke, was the embodiment of command, a low rumble of absolute authority that vibrated through the very walls. "The night is proceeding as planned, Valerius," he called out, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Your concern is noted, but it is unnecessary. Return to your duties. I will not be disturbed again." There was a beat of silence from the other side of the door. Clara held her breath, her ears straining. She could almost picture Valerius standing out there, his head tilted, listening, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. Finally, his voice came again, dripping with a false deference that made the hairs on Clara's arms stand on end. "Of course, my king. My apologies for the intrusion." They listened to the sound of his footsteps receding down the stone corridor until they were swallowed by the silence of the castle. Only then did the tension in the room break. The fight seemed to drain out of them simultaneously, the adrenaline of the confrontation and the subsequent panic leaving a hollow, exhausted ache in its wake. They were left in a heavy, profound silence, the weight of what had happened, of what they now were to each other settling over them like a shroud. Lucian turned his back to her, running a hand through his dark hair, a gesture of profound weariness. He stared into the fire, its flames reflecting in his now muted eyes. He was a king who had built his entire reign on control, on the principle that emotion was a liability and trust was a blade you handed to your enemy. And now the fates had handed him a weakness he could not kill, a vulnerability he could not cage. He was bound to a traitor, a fiery, defiant Omega, who hated him with every fiber of her being. And the most terrifying part was, the bond sang to him. A low, sweet music beneath the noise of his rage, a song of completion his soul had been starving to hear. He turned back to her. Clara was still standing where he had left her, her shoulders slumped, the fight gone from her eyes, replaced by a deep, soul-crushing exhaustion. The chains on her wrists seemed heavier than ever. He looked at the iron cuffs, then at her face, and a decision formed, born not of compassion, but of cold, hard pragmatism. He could not learn what he needed to know, could not begin to unravel this catastrophic knot fate had tied, while she stood before him as a common prisoner. The dynamic was impossible. He walked to a small, ornate chest by his bedside, unlocked it, and retrieved a single, heavy iron key. He returned to her, his movements slow, deliberate. Clara flinched as he approached, her body tensing for another blow, but he simply knelt before her. The sight was so shocking, the Alpha King kneeling, that she forgot to breathe. He didn't look at her face. His gaze was fixed on the heavy iron manacles around her ankles. He inserted the key, and with a sharp click, the lock sprang open. He pushed the heavy iron cuff away, then rose and did the same for her wrists. The chains fell to the fur-covered floor with a heavy, clattering thud that echoed the collapse of the world they had both known just an hour before. Clara rubbed her raw, chafed wrists, the sudden lightness a disorienting sensation. She was free of her chains, but she had never felt more trapped. Lucian stepped back, tossing the key onto the table with a clatter. He looked at her, his expression grim, his eyes clear of their golden glow, but filled with a weary, conflicted darkness. "He cannot know," Lucian said, his voice quiet, stripped of its earlier rage. "No one can know about this, not until I understand what it means." He looked at her, his gaze direct and heavy. "You are still my prisoner, Clara Vale. You are still a traitor who stood against me, but you are also something else." He drew in a long, slow breath. "And we need to talk. Without the chains. The silence that followed was a different kind of quiet from the one in the throne room. That had been a silence of fear and domination. This was a silence of confusion, exhaustion, and a terrifying shared uncertainty. Clara stood in the middle of the room, her freed hands feeling unnervingly light. She watched as Lucian, the king who had threatened to break her, turned away and stared into the fire as if seeking answers in the dancing flames. The rigid line of his shoulders, the way he ran a hand through his hair, it was not the posture of a triumphant king, but of a man burdened by a weight he did not understand. He turned back, his face grim. "You must be hungry," he stated. The words flat, a practical observation that felt absurdly mundane after the cataclysmic revelation that had just occurred. Before she could answer, he walked to a thick tapestry embroidered with a forest scene and pulled a tasseled cord that hung beside it. The action was so normal, so domestic, it was jarring. They waited in that thick silence for what felt like an eternity, not looking at each other, the space between them humming with the ghost of that electric shock. Eventually, a quiet knock came, not at the main door, but at a smaller, concealed one within the tapestry. Lucian opened it to a servant who kept his eyes firmly on the floor, pushing a small cart into the room before bowing low and vanishing as silently as he had appeared. The cart held a roasted chicken, a loaf of dark bread, cheese, and a pitcher of what looked like water. It was simple fare, not the feast she had imagined for a king, but the smell of the roasted meat made Clara's stomach clench with a hunger so fierce it was painful. Lucian gestured to a small table near the fire. "Eat," he commanded. Though the word lacked its earlier bite, it was less a command and more a weary directive. Clara hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her that this was a trap, another layer of his cruel game. But the aroma of the food was a siren's call, and the gnawing emptiness in her belly was a more immediate tyrant than the king standing before her. She moved to the table slowly, her body stiff, and sat on the edge of the heavy wooden chair. Lucian sat opposite her, the small table feeling entirely inadequate to contain his presence. He tore a piece of bread from the loaf and pushed the platter of chicken towards her. They ate in silence at first. The only sounds the crackling of the fire and the soft clink of a knife against the platter. Clara ate with a desperate, controlled urgency, forcing herself to take small bites, to not betray the full depth of her starvation. She could feel his eyes on her, a heavy, analytical gaze. The bond was a low hum in the back of her mind, a constant awareness of him that was both distracting and deeply unsettling. She could feel his weariness, his confusion, and a deep, simmering anger that was now directed not at her, but at fate itself. Finally, he broke the silence, his voice quiet, almost conversational. "Tell me about the Gilded Canyons," he said. "Tell me why you were willing to die to lead a rebellion against me." Clara swallowed a piece of chicken that suddenly tasted like ash. She looked up, meeting his gaze across the table. His eyes, no longer glowing, were the color of a stormy sea, deep and turbulent. She had expected the question to be an accusation, but his tone was one of genuine, if reluctant, curiosity. The bond, she realized, was forcing him to want to understand. "You call it rebellion," she began, her voice low and hoarse. "We called it survival." She set down the piece of bread she was holding, her appetite vanishing as the memories rose, fresh and raw. "The royal ties have always been high, but we have always paid them. We are a proud people, not beggars. But this last year, the winter was the harshest in a generation. The snows came early and stayed late. Our harvest was small, and what little we had, we needed to survive. But your man, Lord Valerius, he came anyway." She saw a flicker of something in Lucian's eyes as she said the name. Recognition. "He demanded the full tithe," Clara continued, her voice gaining strength as the familiar fire of injustice began to burn within her. "We told him we could not pay it and still feed our children. We begged him to take half, to leave us with enough seed grain to plant for the coming spring. He laughed at us. He called it the king's tax and said the king's hounds deserved to eat better than traitors. He took everything, the seed grain, the salted meat, the dried fruits. He emptied our granaries and left us to starve." She leaned forward, her hands gripping the edge of the table, her knuckles white. Do you know what it is to watch a child's eyes grow dull? To hear a baby cry from hunger until it is too weak to even make a sound? We ate boiled leather and bark from the trees. The elders, they stopped eating altogether, so that the young might have a mouthful more. That is why we rebelled, Your Majesty. Not for greed, not for power. We fought because you had already sentenced us to death. We chose to die on our feet, with swords in our hands, rather than on our knees, begging for a crust of bread that never came. Lucian listened, his face an unreadable mask of stone. But Clara could feel the impact of her words through the bond. She felt his flicker of doubt, a seed of guilt. He had delegated regional authority to Valerius, trusting the reports that had landed on his desk. Reports that spoke of a prosperous region and a minor uprising fueled by greed. He had never questioned them. Why would he? Valerius was his man, a loyal beta who had been at his side for years. He looked away from her, his gaze returning to the fire. His voice, when he spoke again, was quiet, distant, as if he were speaking to himself as much as to her. My father was Alpha King before me, he said, the words coming slowly, reluctantly. He was a good man, too good. He ruled with a gentle hand. And he believed in the inherent loyalty of our people. He believed in trust. He paused, and a shadow passed over his face, a darkness that seemed to suck the light from the room. His most trusted beta, a man he had called brother since they were pups, used that trust to poison him, slowly, over months. He turned the court against him with lies and whispers, and when my father was too weak to fight back, he seized power. He picked up his silver goblet, his knuckles white as he gripped the stem. I was young, I was exiled, hunted. I spent 5 years in the wildlands, gathering allies, learning to be stronger, harder than any man who might ever challenge me again. When I returned, I took back my throne, not with trust, but with blood and fear. I killed the usurper with my own hands in the throne room, and I purged the court of anyone whose loyalty was even remotely in question. He finally looked back at her, his eyes burning with the cold fire of his past. I learned that day that mercy is seen as weakness. I learned that trust is a blade you hand to your enemy, hoping they won't use it to slit your throat. I built my rule on strength and fear so that no one could ever break my pack from within again. I made myself a monster so that other monsters would fear me. The confession hung in the air between them, a raw, open wound. For the first time, Clara saw past the tyrant, past the Alpha King, and saw the wounded, paranoid boy who had been forged in the crucible of betrayal. It didn't excuse the suffering of her people. It didn't absolve him of his sins. But it was a reason. It was a crack in the marble facade of the monster she hated. And through the bond, she felt the deep, aching loneliness of his self-imposed isolation, a cold so profound it made her shiver. He saw a king, and she saw a prisoner on a throne of his own making. The meal was forgotten. The tension in the room had changed from one of hostility to one of fragile, reluctant understanding. As Clara looked at him, really looked at him, she noticed something she had missed in her fear and anger. On his left forearm, just below the rolled-up sleeve of his tunic, was a deep gash. It was several inches long, crudely stitched and puckered with inflammation. The skin around it an angry red. It looked painful and poorly cared for. It was the wound of a man who had no one to tend to him. Before she could think, before she could reason with herself, she stood up. Lucian tensed immediately, his hand instinctively going to the hilt of a dagger she hadn't noticed at his belt. His eyes narrowed, all trace of vulnerability gone, replaced by the instant suspicion of a predator. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. Clara ignored him. She walked to the wash basin in the corner of the room, a porcelain bowl and pitcher sitting on a carved wooden stand. She poured water into the bowl, found a clean linen cloth, and then her eyes scanned the shelves of books. Tucked between 2 heavy tomes, she saw a small wooden box. On instinct, she opened it. Inside were dried herbs, salves, and bandages. The scent of calendula and yarrow, herbs for healing, filled the air. She took a pinch of the dried leaves and dropped them into the water, then grabbed a small pot of antiseptic salve. When she turned back to him, he was on his feet, watching her every move, his body coiled like a spring. She approached him slowly, holding the bowl of warm, herb-infused water and the clean cloth. He flinched, a barely perceptible movement, as she came to a stop in front of him. He was so much taller than her, and she had to look up to meet his wary gaze. "Your arm," she said softly. "It's infected. It needs to be cleaned." He stared at her, his mind racing. Why would she do this? What was this new tactic? Was it a trick to get close to him, to find a moment of weakness? But then he felt it, through the bond. A dull, throbbing pain in his own left arm, a phantom echo of the ache from his wound. And he felt her reason, not as a thought, but as a feeling. A quiet, insistent urge to soothe an ache that was now, inexplicably, hers as well. He didn't speak. He simply stood there, his jaw tight, and slowly, hesitantly, extended his arm. Clara set the bowl down on the table and gently took his forearm in her hands. His skin was hot to the touch. His arm was like a steel cable, corded with muscle and roped with veins, but she held it gently, her touch surprisingly steady. She dipped the cloth into the warm water, wrung it out, and began to clean the wound. Her movements were careful, efficient, a skill learned from tending to wounded rebels in the canyons. The moment her fingers made contact with his skin, a different kind of jolt went through them. It was not the violent soul-shattering shock of before. This was a slow, warm current, a quiet hum of energy that flowed from her touch into him. He drew in a sharp breath, his muscles tensing, but he did not pull away. The sensation was utterly foreign. He was used to the clash of steel, the brutal grip of a combatant, the formal, distant touch of a servant. He was not used to this. He was not used to gentleness. The firelight softened the hard, angry lines of his face, casting his features in the shades of gold and shadow. The room was silent again, but this silence was filled with a new kind of tension. It was the quiet intimacy of the moment, the scent of the medicinal herbs, the soft sounds of the cloth against his skin. Clara focused on her task, her gaze fixed on the wound, but she was acutely aware of him, of his stillness, of the warmth of his skin beneath her fingers. The physical attraction that had been a confusing, infuriating undercurrent since she first saw him was now a palpable force, supercharged by the mate bond, rising between them like the heat from the fire. She could feel the steady, powerful beat of his heart, and she was terrifyingly aware that her own was beginning to beat in time with it. He finally broke the silence, his voice a low, rough whisper. "Why are you doing this?" Clara didn't look up from her work. She carefully applied the cool salve to the inflamed skin around the stitches. "The bond," she answered, her voice just as quiet. "It's not just in our minds. I can feel your pain as if it were my own." She paused, then added, the admission costing her a piece of her pride. "It's distracting." He said nothing more. He simply watched her, his stormy eyes tracing the line of her brow, the curve of her cheek, the determined set of her mouth. He watched as she wrapped a clean linen bandage around his arm, her movements deft and sure. When she was finished, her hands lingered on his arm for a fraction of a second too long. The current between them intensified, and the air grew thick, heavy with unspoken words and a rising, undeniable desire. She could feel the heat of his gaze on her, and when she finally dared to look up, she found his eyes were no longer stormy. They were dark, molten, and fixed on her lips. The physical barrier between them had been broken, and in its place, a new, far more dangerous connection had been forged. The moment stretched, taut and fragile, the air in the chamber thick enough to taste. Lucian's gaze was a physical touch on Clara's lips, a brand of heat and promise that made her breath catch. The raw animal magnetism of the mate bond, a force she had fought and feared, was now an undeniable current pulling her closer, drowning her righteous hatred in a wave of pure, unadulterated desire. He was the monster from her nightmares, the destroyer of her world, yet her very soul yearned for him, for the completion his presence offered. He leaned in, his shadow engulfing her, his scent of storm and earth a dizzying perfume. Her eyes fluttered shut, her body swaying toward his, ready for the inevitable collision, but it did not come. With a low growl, a sound of profound self-loathing, Lucian tore himself away. He straightened up, putting a chasm of 2 feet between them, and the spell was broken. The warmth vanished, leaving Clara cold and trembling, her eyes snapping open to see him turning his back on her. He stalked to the window, bracing his hands on the cold stone of the casement, his knuckles white. He stared out into the moonlit darkness, his broad back a wall of rigid, conflicted muscle. The king who had built his reign on absolute control had just been brought to the brink by a touch, by a scent, by a rebel Omega who was his fated mate. The weakness was intolerable. "This changes nothing," he said to the glass, his voice a harsh rasp. "And it changes everything." He took a deep, ragged breath, the cool night air doing little to quell the fire in his blood. "Your claims against Valerius, I dismiss them as the lies of a traitor, but the bond, it does not lie. It feels the echo of your truth, and it sickens me." He turned from the window, his face once again a mask of cold command, but his eyes held a new, dangerous light. "I will not be ruled by a feeling. I will be ruled by facts. I will see these gilded canyons of yours for myself. I will see the truth of your words written in the faces of your people." Clara stared at him, her heart hammering. He was going to go? He was actually going to investigate? A fragile, impossible tendril of hope began to unfurl in her chest. "And if you find I was telling the truth?" she dared to ask, her voice barely a whisper. "If you see the starvation and the graves that Valerius dug with his greed?" Lucian's eyes narrowed. "If your claims are true, then Lord Valerius has committed treason against the crown by weakening a royal territory and lying to his Alpha, a crime for which the only punishment is death." He paused, his gaze sweeping over her, intense and possessive. "And I will have my answers. We ride at dawn." The journey was nothing like the royal processions that occasionally terrorized the countryside. There were no banners, no gleaming column of knights in polished steel. It was a small, grim party of 20 of Lucian's most elite guards. The hounds, alphas, and betas, whose loyalty was to him and him alone. They moved swiftly, their horses bred for speed and stamina, their expressions as hard and unforgiving as the land itself. Clara rode a sturdy mare, not in chains, but surrounded by guards on all sides. Her presence was a source of confusion and suspicion among the men. She was the rebel leader, the traitor, yet the king kept her close, his eyes constantly straying to her, a silent, protective warning to anyone who might look at her with malice. Their captain, a stern alpha woman named Alara with a scar that cut through her lip, watched them both with a sharp, analytical gaze, her thoughts her own. As they rode, the landscape changed. The lush green forests and fertile fields that surrounded Blackwood Keep gradually gave way to rocky, scrub-covered hills. The earth grew paler, the trees more stunted, the air thinner. This was the approach to the Gilded Canyons, a name that had become a bitter joke. They were gilded only by the fool's gold of the setting sun on the barren rock. Clara felt the change in the land like a physical ache. This was her home. These were her wounds. Through the bond, Lucian felt a shadow of her sorrow, a hollow ache that settled in his own chest, mingling with his growing unease. When they finally entered the first village, a heavy silence fell over the party. The reports had spoken of prosperity. The reality was a portrait of desolation. Huts that should have been bustling with life stood silent, their doors hanging open like mouths frozen in a silent scream. The fields were barren, not a single green shoot to be seen. And the people, the few who dared to show their faces, were like ghosts. They were thin to the point of emaciation, their skin stretched tight over their bones, their eyes large and hollow in their gaunt faces. They stared at the king's party not with anger, but with a dull, hopeless terror, before scurrying back into the shadows of their dilapidated homes. There were no children playing in the dirt road. There was no laughter. There was only the whisper of the wind through the empty doorways. Clara's face was a mask of stone, but Lucian could feel her grief, a wave of it so powerful it almost made him gasp. She urged her horse forward, stopping beside him. "Do you see it now?" she asked, her voice thick with unshed tears. "This is the prosperity Lord Valerius reported to you. This is the peace you created, Your Majesty, the peace of the grave." Her words were a spear in his gut. He looked from the hollowed-out faces of the villagers to the empty, dusty square, and for the first time in his reign, Lucian Storm felt the bitter, corrosive taste of shame. He had been so focused on the enemies at his gates and the vipers in his court that he had allowed a wolf to savage his own flock. He had trusted, and his trust had been used to starve his people. The betrayal was as sharp and as deep as the one that had killed his father. His rage, a cold, controlled thing, began to build. A glacier of fury moving slowly but unstoppably toward a single target, Lord Valerius. He turned in his saddle, his eyes finding his captain. "Alara," he commanded, his voice ringing with an authority that made the very air tremble. The villagers who had been hiding in their doorways flinched, expecting a blow. "Open our supply wagons. Distribute food and medicine to these people immediately. Every last ration." He then turned his gaze to another guard. "You, ride back to the capital. Ride as if the hounds of hell are on your heels. Find Lord Valerius. Summon him to the throne room. Tell him his king has questions that require answers." His voice dropped, becoming a low, deadly promise. "Tell him I will be waiting." The guard nodded, his eyes wide, and spurred his horse, galloping back the way they had come. A murmur went through the villagers. Food? Medicine? They crept out of their homes, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and a desperate, fragile hope. Clara watched as Alara and her soldiers began to unload sacks of grain, salted meat, and medical supplies, their movements efficient and professional. She looked back at Lucian, at the hard line of his jaw, at the cold fire in his eyes, and she saw not the tyrant who had condemned her, but a king awakening to his duty, a flicker of the ruler she had once, long ago, hoped he could be. The return journey was different. A new tension hung in the air, but it was not one of hostility. It was the tense, focused energy of a hunting party that has scented its prey. Lucian's fury was a palpable thing, a cold, silent storm that every guard could feel. He rode closer to Clara now, a silent acknowledgement of their new, fragile alliance. She was no longer just his prisoner. She was his witness, the proof of his failure and the key to his retribution. They chose a path through a dense, ancient forest, a shortcut that would save them half a day's ride. The canopy of the trees was so thick that it blotted out the sun, plunging the path into a perpetual twilight. Dappled light filtered through the leaves, painting shifting patterns on the forest floor. It was beautiful, but it was also a place of shadows, a place where danger could easily hide. Clara felt a prickle of unease, her senses, honed by years of living on the edge, telling her that something was wrong. The woods were too quiet. No birdsong, no rustle of small animals in the undergrowth. She was about to voice her concern when the world exploded into chaos. An arrow, black-fletched and silent, hissed out of the trees and buried itself in the chest of the guard, riding just ahead of her. He gave a choked cry and toppled from his horse before he even knew he was dead. It was the signal. From the shadows on both sides of the path, assassins erupted, clad in dark leather, their faces obscured by hoods. They moved with a fluid, deadly grace, their blades flashing in the dim light. Lucian's reaction was instantaneous and terrifying. The civilized veneer of the king vanished, and the primal alpha wolf took over. A guttural roar of pure fury was ripped from his throat as he drew his sword, the sound more animal than human. He moved with a brutal, terrifying efficiency, his body a whirlwind of steel and death. He was no longer just a man fighting, he was a force of nature, his instincts screaming one imperative above all others: protect his mate. He maneuvered his horse, placing himself between Clara and the thickest of the fighting, his sword a blur as it parried, blocked, and killed. Clara's mind raced. These were not common bandits. They were professionals, their attack coordinated, their target specific. They were trying to get to Lucian, but several were also pushing towards her. Valerius. He knew the king had gone to the canyons, and he knew that she was the reason why. This was not just an assassination attempt. It was an act of silencing. Another assassin raised a crossbow, taking aim at Lucian's back while he was engaged with two others. There was no time to shout a warning. Acting on pure instinct, Clara yanked her mare's reins, pulling the horse into a sharp, rearing turn. She kicked its flanks, sending it crashing sideways into the dense undergrowth, creating a sudden, loud diversion. The crossbowman flinched, his concentration broken for a split second. It was all Lucian needed. He spun, his sword lashing out, and the man fell with a choked gasp. Lucian's eyes met Clara's over the chaos of the battle, a flash of surprise and gratitude in their depths before the wolf took over again. "To me," he roared, and Clara, without hesitation, urged her horse through the fray, coming to his side. They were back to back now, a king and a rebel, an alpha and an omega, a single deadly unit against a common foe. He was a storm of violence, a shield of muscle and steel, while she, with her knowledge of the terrain and her quick wits, became his eyes, calling out warnings, pointing out hidden attackers. The hounds, recovering from the initial shock, had formed a defensive circle, fighting with the grim efficiency they were famous for. The assassins were skilled, but they had underestimated the raw fury of an Alpha King fighting for his mate. Lucian's power seemed to fill the forest, a tangible wave of dominance that bolstered his men and struck fear into his enemies. Seeing their numbers dwindling and their primary target an unbreakable wall of fury, the remaining assassins faltered. Lucian saw their hesitation and pressed his advantage, his voice a roar that shook the very leaves on the trees. "They dare attack their king," he bellowed, his eyes blazing with golden light as he cut down another attacker. He turned his head slightly, his gaze locking with Clara's, a possessive feral fire burning in his eyes. "And his mate." The word mate, spoken aloud in the heat of battle, was a definitive claim, a public declaration before his most loyal men. It was a line drawn in blood and steel. In that moment, Clara was no longer a traitor. She was his, the future queen, and the assassins had just made the fatal mistake of threatening her. The fight was over moments later. The last of the assassins, seeing their cause was lost, tried to flee, but the hounds cut them down. Silence descended upon the forest, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the heavy, ragged breathing of the survivors. The air was thick with the coppery scent of blood. Adrenaline, sharp and metallic, still sang in Clara's veins. She looked at Lucian. He was covered in blood, some of it his, most of it not. A shallow cut bled freely on his cheek, but his eyes were fixed on her, blazing with a fierce, protective light. He dismounted in one fluid motion and was at her side, his hands reaching up to her. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice rough, his hands scanning her body for injuries with a frantic urgency. "No," she breathed, her voice shaking. "I'm all right." His hands cupped her face, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks. His touch a strange combination of reverence and raw possession. The adrenaline of the fight, the terror, the relief, it all swirled between them, feeding the fire that had been simmering since their first touch. The world narrowed to the space between them, to the heat of his hands on her skin, to the wild, possessive look in his golden eyes. The passion that had been born of conflict and destiny, forged in the heat of battle, could no longer be denied. He didn't ask. He didn't bargain. He claimed. He lowered his head and his lips crashed down on hers. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a kiss of fire and blood, of desperation and relief, of a king claiming his queen and a man claiming his soulmate. It was raw, hungry, and utterly consuming. Clara's hands came up to grip his arms, her fingers digging into his blood-slicked leather tunic as she kissed him back with all the pent-up fear, anger, and burgeoning love that was warring within her. It was not a surrender, it was an acceptance, a sealing of the bond, not with a whisper in a darkened room, but with a roar of defiance in a forest of shadows, a promise made in the aftermath of a battle for their lives. What had begun as a punishment had become a partnership, and in that desperate, passionate kiss, a new destiny for the kingdom was forged. The kiss ended as it had begun, with a raw, desperate intensity that left them both breathless. Lucian pulled back slowly, his forehead resting against hers, his chest heaving. The golden fire in his eyes had softened to a warm, molten glow, and he looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, not as a rebel or an omega, but as the other half of his soul. The forest was silent around them, the scent of blood and pine mingling in the cool air. The battle was over, but the war for their future had just been declared. He straightened up, his hands still framing her face, a new, unshakable resolve hardening his features. The passion of the moment receded, replaced by the cold fury of a king whose trust had been betrayed, and whose mate had been threatened. He turned to Captain Alara, who was directing her soldiers with grim efficiency, tending to the wounded and securing the dead assassins. "Alara, check the bodies," Lucian commanded, his voice once again the voice of the Alpha King, cold and sharp as forged steel. "Find anything that ties them to their master. A signet, a tattoo, a maker's mark on their blades. I want proof." He looked back at Clara, his gaze softening for only a second. "We ride for Blackwood Keep. Now." Justice has been delayed long enough. The rest of the journey was a blur of grim determination. They rode hard, the hounds forming a tight protective escort around their king and the woman he had publicly claimed. The news of the attack and of the king's declaration had spread through the ranks like wildfire. The guards looked at Clara differently now, with a mixture of awe and respect. She was no longer the traitor, she was the king's mate, the future queen who had fought beside them. They arrived at Blackwood Keep as the sun was setting, painting the sky in brutal strokes of orange and red. The castle gates swung open before them, and they galloped into the courtyard without slowing. Lucian dismounted, turning to lift Clara from her horse before her feet could even touch the ground. He kept his arm around her waist, a possessive public gesture as they strode towards the great hall, his hounds falling into step behind them. The castle was abuzz with activity. Servants and courtiers scattered before them, their eyes wide with fear and curiosity. The air was thick with anticipation. The throne room was already packed, the entire court summoned and waiting in a state of high tension. They stood in tight, nervous clusters, their fine silks and velvets a riot of color against the grim gray stone. At the foot of the dais, flanked by two of his own guards, stood Lord Valerius. He looked perfectly composed, his handsome face arranged in an expression of concerned loyalty. When he saw Lucian and Clara enter together, his eyes widened for a fraction of a second. A flicker of surprise he quickly masked. He had expected the king to return alone, with the story of the rebels' unfortunate demise. He had not expected this united front. Lucian did not ascend his throne. He stopped in the center of the room, pulling Clara to his side, his arm a band of iron around her. He was the storm, and she was its calm, unshakable center. He let the silence stretch, his cold gaze sweeping over his court before finally landing on Valerius. "Lord Valerius," Lucian began, his voice deceptively calm, yet it cut through the silence like a shard of glass. "You answered my summons." "Good." Valerius bowed low, a perfect picture of deference. "Your Majesty, I came as soon as I received your message. I was deeply concerned to hear you had ridden into the treacherous gilded canyons. I trust your journey was fruitful?" "Oh, it was," Lucian replied, a cruel smile touching his lips. "I saw the prosperous villages you reported. I saw the well-fed people. I saw the peace and order you have so diligently maintained in my name." His voice began to rise, each word laced with a growing, terrible fury. "I saw children with the faces of old men and women who looked like walking skeletons. I saw empty granaries and fresh graves. You reported a rebellion of greed, Valerius. You lied. You starved my people for your own profit. You bled my lands for a few extra coins in your purse, and you drove them to a despair so deep that they chose to face my armies, rather than endure your peace." A collective gasp went through the court. Valerius's face had gone pale, but he held his ground. "Your Majesty, these are baseless accusations. The Omega has clearly filled your head with lies to save her own skin. She is a traitor. You cannot possibly take her word over that of your most loyal—" "Loyal?" Lucian's laugh was a terrifying sound, devoid of all humor. "Captain Alara." Alara stepped forward, her face grim. From a leather pouch, she produced a silver signet ring, its face carved with the image of a striking viper. She held it up for the court to see. "We found this on the body of the lead assassin, Your Majesty. And this." She produced a crossbow bolt, identical to the one that had nearly killed Lucian. The fletching is peacock feather, dyed black, a signature favored by the Nightfang mercenaries, whose services, as we all know, are notoriously expensive. Lucian's gaze returned to Valerius, his eyes burning with cold fire. "Tell me, my lord, how does a simple regional governor afford the services of the Nightfangs? And why does their leader wear your family's signet ring?" The trap was sprung. Valerius was cornered, the evidence against him undeniable. The mask of loyalty shattered, and the sneering, ambitious wolf beneath was revealed. He straightened up, his lip curling in contempt. "So the great Alpha King has grown weak? Besotted by a little Omega traitor, she has bewitched you with her spells and her body. Look at you, letting her stand beside you as if she were your equal. The court will not follow a king ruled by his bedmate." The insult was a calculated one, designed to provoke Lucian, to paint him as a weak, compromised leader. But Lucian did not rise to the bait. He simply smiled, a slow, dangerous smile that did not reach his eyes. He pulled Clara closer, his hand resting possessively on her hip. "She is not my bedmate, Valerius," he said, his voice dropping, yet carrying to every corner of the silent, watching room. "She is my fated mate." The shock that ripped through the court was a physical thing. 100 gasps, a wave of disbelief and awe. This changed everything. It was not a sordid affair. It was the will of the goddess. Lucian's voice rose again, ringing with absolute power and conviction. "She is the future queen of this kingdom, and you have threatened her. You have threatened me. You have betrayed your pack and your alpha." He took a step forward, his hand finally going to the hilt of his greatsword. "That is a mistake you will not live to regret." Seeing he was utterly lost, that his ambition had turned to ash, Valerius gave in to his final, desperate impulse. With a snarl of rage, he drew his own sword. "If I am to die, I will take the weak king who brought this kingdom to ruin with me. I challenge you." It was not a fight. It was an execution. Valerius was a skilled swordsman, but Lucian was a warrior forged in the fires of exile and war, an Alpha King in his prime, fueled by a righteous fury and the power of his bond. His great sword was a blur of motion, a silver whirlwind of death. He parried Valerius's frantic attack with contemptuous ease, his movements economical and brutally effective. The clash of steel echoed through the throne room, a frantic, one-sided rhythm. Lucian disarmed him with a flick of his wrist, sending Valerius's sword clattering across the stone floor. He followed it with a powerful kick to the chest that sent the beta sprawling onto his back. Lucian stood over him, the tip of his greatsword resting on Valerius's throat. The room was utterly silent, every courtier holding their breath. Valerius stared up at him, his eyes wide with terror. The last of his arrogance gone. "Mercy," he choked out, the word a pathetic squeak. Lucian looked down at him, his face a mask of cold, unforgiving stone. "Mercy is for the loyal," he said, his voice quiet but absolute. "For traitors there is only justice." And with a single powerful thrust, he ended it. He stood there for a long moment, the body of the traitor at his feet, his sword dripping blood onto the black stone. He was the Alpha King, his dominance reasserted, his authority absolute and terrifying. The court was silent, frozen in a mixture of fear and awe. Then, slowly, he turned away from the body, away from the violence. He wiped his blade on the dead man's tunic, a final act of contempt, before sheathing it with a decisive click. He turned to face Clara. The fury was gone from his eyes, replaced by a look of such profound, unguarded emotion that it made her heart ache. He held out his hand to her, a simple, open gesture, an invitation. Clara walked to him, her steps sure and steady. She placed her hand in his, and his fingers closed around hers, warm and strong. He pulled her gently up the 3 steps of the dais, to stand beside his gnarled weirwood throne. They stood together, equals, looking out over the stunned and silent court. Lucian raised their joined hands, his voice carrying like thunder through the hall. "For too long, this kingdom has been ruled by fear alone. That ends tonight." His words struck the court like a hammer, shattering the silence into hushed, frantic whispers. He stood tall, unshaken, every inch the Alpha King. Yet the court's eyes flicked again and again to the woman at his side. The rebel Omega, now lifted to stand as his equal. Clara's fingers trembled in his, but she did not pull away. Her gaze swept the chamber, the courtiers, the banners, the blood cooling on the black stone floor, and she felt the weight of it all pressing down on her. They saw a queen, but she knew the truth. She was no savior draped in silk. She was still a prisoner of fate, bound to a monster she despised, standing on a throne built from bones. She tilted her head, just enough for her voice to reach him, low and fierce. "This changes nothing between us, Lucian. I will never be yours." The king's smile curved, sharp as a blade, his storm-gray eyes glinting with possession and something darker. He leaned closer, his whisper a vow only she could hear. "And yet, little wolf, you already are.